today I thought I'd give you a little taste of Wonderfeast then by taking you on a Roman adventure, a little passeggiata, a stroll through the Eternal City to see some familiar sights and to explore some less known treasures. And what is a passeggiata? It's a stroll. It's really an Italian, and I would say kind of Mediterranean and Latin, let's say, ritual. It's something that people do a lot in the evenings, especially when the weather is nice, in the summertime, and throughout the year, really, when it's cooler at any time, after work, and on the weekends, people will go for a passeggiata or a stroll through their city, their town, their neighborhood. And the idea is that you're just enjoying and taking in the sights. And there's certainly sights that you know well and you've seen numerous times, but it's an opportunity to be outside. It's an opportunity also to socialize. And it's something very different from what we do in America. The stroll is not really part of our cultural tradition so much here. If anything, if we go for a walk, it's to get steps in, or maybe we'll go for a run, or, there's a goal, there's some kind of a fitness goal involved. Usually it's less about pleasing the senses, pleasing the eye with the beautiful sights, and maybe the nose with the smells of the cafes or the restaurants, etc. And obviously pleasing one's heart by being in the company of friends or family and just having a nice chat as you stroll along. So we'll wander and soak it all in. And then, at the end of our exploration, I invite you to share more thoughts and questions if you have them. So let's start with maps, because maps are a great way to get oriented, despite what Google and other apps may want us to believe. They've always got us in such a very specific location, and we don't really get the bigger picture often enough with these kind of these phone GPS systems that we've become so reliant on. So here's Europe. Western Europe primarily, with and Central and Eastern a little bit too. We have Italy poking out, the boot pokes out into the Mediterranean. And what we're going to do today is we're going to look primarily at Rome. There's Rome with its environs, and specifically we're looking at what Romans would refer to today as the centro storico, the historic center of downtown Rome. That's the part of the city that's all full of the goodies. I mean, there's a lot of Rome, believe me. The part of Rome that generally you go to when you are visiting the city is just a fraction of the overall city. And it's mostly this part right here. Yeah, it's mostly, this is what you're looking at: the Colosseum, the Campo dei Fiori, the Pantheon, the Spanish Steps, Villa Borghese maybe, and you've got St. Peter's and the Vatican, right? It's mostly this part of the city that you're kind of bopping around. And that's what we're going to be focusing on. So in the wise words of Maria von Trapp, let's start at the very beginning, because it's a very good place to start. And specifically, we're going to start with the ancient city, the Foro Romano, the ruins of the Roman Forum. And we're flying above the Capitoline Hill. And because we have wings, we're magic on this passeggiata. So we've sprouted wings. We could do these kinds of things that we wouldn't normally be able to do if we were just on our feet. We're flying above the Capitoline Hill, which is one of the 7 hills of Rome. And depending on who you're reading, the 7 hills of Rome change. But definitely the Capitoline Hill is like the #1 of the 7 hills of Rome. Okay. By the way, incidentally, etymology, which I'm really big on. I love etymology, not to be confused with entomology, although bugs are very interesting too. But etymology, Capitoline, Capitolino, is the name of the hill. It's also the root of our word capital. So the capital city, yeah, or the Capitol building, it comes from the name Capitoline, as in the Capitoline Hill. And so from the Capitoline Hill here, in our bird's eye view, with our wings that we've sprouted, we can see in the distance the Colosseum, which we're going to get to in a little bit. We can also see way in the even more distance, we can see the Sabine Hills, because running through the center of Italy are the Apennine Mountains. Yeah, and they run all the way down the boot from the Alps. Basically, they go west a little bit into Liguria, and then they go down the center of the boot and all the way into Sicily and Sardinia and so on and so forth. Okay. So what we're looking at here is a reconstruction. And this is kind of what we're, if we were looking in this direction, yeah, this is what we're seeing here, okay? This that we're looking at here is this reconstructed. And you can see that it's dotted with great civic buildings like basilicas. Incidentally, a basilica to the ancient Romans was a government hall. It was not a religious structure. The word basilica is later appropriated by Christians when Christianity becomes the dominant religion in the empire, in the Roman Empire, okay, to mean a place of worship, a great church, a large church, right? But originally a basilica for the ancient Romans was a civic building. It housed offices and courts of law. And this is the Basilica of Maxentius and Emperor Constantine, who replaced Maxentius to become the Emperor of Rome. Then we have, of course, we have the Senate building right there. We have the rostrum. The rostrum was the stage from which the speakers would speak. And here you can see the ruins of the rostrum right here. They would speak to all the folks gathered in the forum square, which you can see right here. Yeah, and people would actually gather there to hear what's the latest news. I mean, that was the equivalent of the, you know, of the newspapers of the time, right? You have loads of course, temple remains everywhere, right? And of course, we have our requisite triumphal arches. Triumphal arches. Romans were very big on triumphal arches. Anytime they had a military campaign that ended in a victory, let's erect a triumphal arch. So we have here, this is the triumphal arch of Titus. And you can see the triumphal arch of Titus right here, right next to the Colosseum, built under the imperial reign of his father and then completed during his imperial reign. And you can see the reliefs on the inside of the Arch of Titus depicting the Roman soldiers sacking the Temple of Jerusalem from the 1st century CE. And you can actually see them carrying out the Ark of the Covenant and the great menorah from the Second Temple of Jerusalem there. Then we could also see a little bit closer to where this picture has been taken from. We can see the ruins of the Arch of Septimius Severus. The Arch of Septimius Severus bearing an inscription at the top here. You can see right here. This inscription is a really interesting one because here we have Septimius Severus's son Gita's name has been scrubbed off the inscription by his infamous brother Caracalla, because Caracalla, when their father Septimius Severus died, decided he really didn't want to share the imperial throne with his brother Gita. So what does he do? He removes the bronze letters that were once hammered into the inscription here and that, spelled out Gita's name. He kills his brother Gita. He removes Gita's name from the inscription. And not only that, the guy basically replaces Gita's name with Optimis Fortimisque Princeps after his own name, which means greatest and strongest of princes, after his own name. So now he's not only killed his brother, but he's actually bragging about how fantastic he is. Because, why share the throne when you can have it to yourself? And let's face it, the history of Rome is basically founded on the concept of fratricide. Because, you got the very first king of Rome is Romulus, right? Well, Romulus supposedly, at least according to the legend, kills his brother Remus to become the first king of what he then goes on to call Roma. Because let's face it, if it had been Remus who killed Romulus, we would probably be referring to it as Rima. Okay? So, fratricide is a big part of ancient Rome. So now we are leaving this part of the Roman Forum, and we're going to the Colosseum. And here we have a photograph of the Colosseum with Mussolini, Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator from the early 20th century, parading his troops down the Via dei Fori Imperiali. And the Via dei Fori Imperiali is one of the few straight roads in Rome, in downtown Rome. You can see it right here. It's a great big, huge huge road that Mussolini built in the early 20th century so that he could parade his troops from the Colosseum down into the center of the city, thus linking his fascist ambitions to the imperial past. Do you see? In fact, prior to Mussolini's rule, not only did the Via dei Fori Imperiali not exist, but these ruins were largely covered in layers and layers and layers of sediment. So this whole area was actually excavated for the first time during the fascist rule of Mussolini. Why? Because he had a great, concern for the ancient past of Rome. Yes, maybe, but primarily because he wanted to link that ancient past, the imperial past, to the fascist present. Do you see? All right. And let's remember that what we're looking at here in the forum, by the way, is primarily imperial remains. Because when you talk about ancient Rome, you're actually talking about over 1,000 years of history. Starts with the first 7 kings of Rome, the very first of whom is Romulus, right? Then that all goes south in, 500 and something BCE, yeah? Then you have the Republican period from 500 and something BCE until the 1st century BCE. And then you have the empire. Imperial era starts in 13 BCE and lasts into 476 CE, depending on who you're reading. So you're talking about many different, periods of history. And even within the imperial age, you're talking about 500 years. So are we talking about early empire, high empire, middle empire, or late empire? No? Okay. So back to Mussolini. Here he is, right? Parading his troops down the Via dei Fori Imperiali that he's just built by basically evicting a whole bunch of people who lived in a neighborhood that was right there. Knocked that down so he could make his big street. And notice that he's also appropriated the imperial eagle as the insignia of his fascist rule. Okay. All right, so let's talk about this most famous of Rome's ancient piles by far, the Colosseum. Yeah, there we are. Okay, its name comes from a colossal statue of Emperor Nero that stood on this site and that was erected when the area was occupied by Nero's sprawling estate, known as the Domus Aurea, the Golden Palace. This is what we're just looking at, the Roman Forum right here. Look at how huge this golden house once was. This is the Palatine Hill, yeah? One of the other major and very important hills of Rome. That's the hill on which supposedly Romulus founded Rome. And in fact, they've actually found remains on the Palatine Hill dating back to the Bronze Age. So it actually kind of lines up historically. So in our November trip, we'll be going to the Palatine. We'll be looking at the ancient ruins there on that hill. As far as the Domus Aurea is concerned, there is not much left of it. But this is what was once, this whole area was once part of that sprawling estate of that much hated Emperor Nero. And there's his bust right then, right? The marble bust right there. Okay. And why was this enormous, huge, sprawling estate all basically claimed by Nero? Because he built it, again, listen to the gall. He built his private estate on grounds on a part of the city, a large part of the city that had burned down during the famous fire of 64 CE. Okay. So, oh no, Rome is burning. Oh my goodness, how horrible. And to his credit, he did actually engage imperial funds in rebuilding parts of the city that had been destroyed by the fire. He did a lot of sort of, how do you say, post disaster relief in terms of funds for the citizens and building up the city again and so on and so forth. But then, he's like, okay, but I'm just going to take this nice big chunk of the city right here because it's burned down anyway. I'm going to turn it into a really beautiful place, right? And what's the big story about Nero? Does anybody remember what supposedly he did during the fire? Do we have any takers here? He fiddled. He supposedly fiddled while Rome burned. Now, we don't know if that's actually true or not. In fact, it probably isn't true. Okay. But Nero was an amateur poet. He fancied himself quite a poet. He fancied himself quite a musician. He did subject his senators and his, cabinet and so on and so forth to these sort of endless, poetry performances and readings and so on and so forth, which apparently were not very good, right? But it's later, it's in the Middle Ages, actually. No, I stand corrected. It's in the later imperial age that his name is smeared by later emperors in order to sort of curry favor with the people of Rome after Nero is long gone, you see. And so the story about Nero fiddling while Rome burns is actually a myth. But as we say in Rome, when it comes to good stories, se non è vero, è ben trovato. Se non è vero, è ben trovato, which is basically, in Italian, that means if it's not true, it at least makes a really good story. Yeah? Okay. So Romans like a good story. The whole city is all about myth. Romulus and Remus and the she-wolf and whatever, blah, 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 and Rome fiddling, Nero fiddling, whatever. It's all myth, okay? There's a lot of history, but the myth makes the history a little bit more sparkly, right? So, se non è vero, è ben trovato. Few know that the official name of the structure is actually the Flavian Amphitheater. The Flavian Amphitheater commemorates a new dynasty of emperors. The Flavian family that started with Vespasian, this fellow here, who rose to power in the late 1st century CE when he ousted Nero, the last of the Julio-Claudians. Yeah? You're the new emperor on the block from a whole new dynasty. How do you convince the potentially dangerous hordes of Roman plebeians who rise up in demonstration and cause all kinds of, civic unrest and havoc at the drop of a hat that you're okay? Well, you heroically give them back the land that the previous much despised emperor seized from them after that fire to build his estate, and you build a gigantic sports stadium where they can attend events for free. You thus keep them busy, occupied, right? In the words of Juvenal, the late 1st and early 2nd century author and playwright, you essentially give them bread and circus. What does this mean? By the late 1st century of the imperial age, people living within the walls of Rome didn't pay taxes because the rest of the empire was funding the city and its inhabitants. And not only that, but plebeians had welfare. They had wheat given to those who were unemployed. So if you did not have a job, you were given flour, hence the bread part of that saying. And what does he mean by circus? Well, circus is the Roman word for a stadium, especially these oblong oval stadia, where there would be sports competitions. But circus came to mean just any kind of place or arena where games took place, whether gladiatorial combat or animal games in quotations, because the animal games, right, in Rome and in the empire more largely, are considered by historians to be responsible for the decimation of the wild animal population of northern Africa. Yeah, there used to be giraffes and elephants and lions. I mean, remember, Hannibal marched on Rome from Carthage. Carthage is in Tunisia, northern Tunisia, on elephants. There were elephants in Tunisia. Okay, you cannot find elephants in Tunisia nowadays, and that's largely because of the Roman imperial games. So, games with a grain of salt, huh? And a lot of animal blood. Allora, so any questions? Any questions before we go on from the ancient Roman part of the city? Questions, comments, thoughts, ideas, perplexities? Niente di niente? We all good? Okay. And don't hesitate to speak up whenever. You don't have to wait for me to ask you for questions. Okay, so now we're going to backtrack. We're going to backtrack. We are backtracking right here. You see, here we are. We're walking back down the main drag of the Roman Forum. Back, we're looking back at the Capitoline Hill. So basically, we're walking from the Colosseum. We're walking in this direction toward the Capitoline Hill, and we can see the Palazzo del Municipio. This is the town hall atop the Capitoline Hill nowadays. That's what we're looking at from the back here. Yeah. Okay. And we are coming back down the Roman Forum from the Colosseum, and we're going to walk up the little side staircase there. And we're going to take a little picture because, it's Rome, and there's the Forum at our feet. And there's Barbara Hollowell. Ciao, Barbara. There she is. She's listening tonight. So there she is with her friend Laura and some other Wonderfeasters. This was our very first maiden voyage, our very first seminar in 2013. And we are going to come up to the top of the Capitoline Hill to the gorgeous Campidoglio, the beautiful square atop the Capitoline Hill, which was designed by Michelangelo. And we're going to walk down Michelangelo's gorgeous cordonata, the beautiful monumental staircase that connects the Capitoline Hill to the lower portion of the city at its base. Specifically, we're going to lose ourselves in the beautiful streets. Here we are walking down the Cordonata of the picturesque Jewish ghetto. All right. Formerly a cramped, squalid area into which Rome's Jews were forced to live as of the 16th century. It's now a picturesque neighborhood featuring the poetically crumbling Portico d'Ottavia, imperial Romans turned fish market in the Middle Ages. We will also pass by diners enjoying their carciofi alla Giudia, one of the most traditional of Roman dishes, and a lot of Roman cuisine is based on Jewish dishes. The Jews in Rome were the very first Jews to come to Europe. Okay, so the earliest European diaspora or let's say the earliest Europe-based community of Jews from what we would consider now the Holy Land, Israel, etc., were the ones who eventually settled in Rome. And then there were many other waves of Jewish people settling in Rome throughout the imperial, the Republican, and then the imperial age. So then we have one of the prettiest fountains in downtown Rome. This is also in the Jewish ghetto. This is the beautiful Fontana delle Tartarughe, scenic backdrop to many a tourist selfie, guilty as charged. And now we go on, we walk north. So we've just come from this area here of the ancient Roman ruins, and we are walking down here into the Roman ghetto, and the Jewish ghetto, sorry, and we go north, and maybe we'll stop at Roscioli, which is a local bakery for a much needed, typically Roman lunch on the go of pizza bianca and mortadella, or maybe if we're vegetarian, mozzarella di bufala, right? And so the oil and the rock salt of the warm, thin, crunchy pizza-like bread combines with the sliced cheese or salami. And by the way, mortadella is the original bologna, by the way. Okay, to create a mouth-watering combination. And with our pizza bianca con la mortadella in hand, Contentedly munching along, we move into the heart of medieval Rome. So this is medieval Rome. This is the ancient city over here. That's interesting. It's largely a park nowadays. And this is the medieval city. So what's that all about? Well, it just so happens that by the time the empire is starting to crumble, then this starts to happen already in the 3rd century CE. By the 5th century CE, there's just the emperors are succeeding each other one after the other. It's a total mess. The whole place is just falling apart. And you have barbarian hordes, as the Romans referred to them, coming into Italy from the north, from what is largely, let's say, modern day Germany, and even further north, Scandinavia. They're coming down into Italy to Rome to seize some of the treasure that can be found in Rome, right? And take it home with them or settle themselves there, which maybe explains why my dad was a redhead. I don't know. Anyway, and they are these barbarian chieftains install themselves as the new emperors of Rome. And one of the things they do to cripple the city is they destroy the aqueducts. So by destroying the aqueducts, the people of Rome no longer have drinking water very easily available to them like they did when they were living primarily in this part of the city, okay? So they move into this bend in the city here, which in the imperial era had been the training grounds for the imperial army. And they move into this bend in the river to be close to the river Tiber and also to be protected by the river on basically 2 sides, yeah? So that by the 10th century CE, you have about 20 to 30,000 inhabitants in Rome, whereas during the height of the ancient imperial age, during the late 1st and early 2nd century CE, you had 1 million inhabitants in Rome. So Rome has really become a backwater. It's become a kind of forgotten, erstwhile, place of glory and modern in the medieval period, cesspool of plague and dilapidation. All right. So the ancient city was all but forgotten by the Middle Ages, with people crowding into that bend in the river for access to water. And from the Middle Ages, it's no longer the emperors who are in charge, but the popes. So it's very important to realize that from the Middle Ages until the 19th century, the popes were not just spiritual leaders. They were not just religious figureheads. They were temporal princes. They owned land. The whole central swath of Italy, Lazio, Umbria, parts of Tuscany, and up into what is now the area of modern day Bologna, yeah? All of that was known as the Papal States. And the Papal States were owned by the Pope. So you paid taxes to the Pope when you lived in the Papal States. All right. So the popes had land, and therefore they had wealth. And therefore they had a lot of skin in the game of who's in charge of what part of Italy, because Italy was constantly being, fought over by different powers. And there was no Italy until the 19th century. There really is no such thing. So papal Rome grew as a hodgepodge in this part of the city of mostly residential structures in a maze of narrow streets and alleys, some of them still bearing the names of the trades or activities practiced here during the centuries. You have Via dei Chiavari, the street of the key makers, Arco degli Acetari that we see here in the lower left-hand corner, which is a beautiful little archway. And look at this ancient Roman column here that's been stuck into the side of the wall. And look at this incredible courtyard, yeah? This is probably easily from the, I would say, 13th century, if not even before, these buildings that are still inhabited. You can tell they're medieval because the windows are so tiny and the walls are very thick. But it's an incredible little courtyard. And it was where the vinegar makers were. And we might go all the way to, of course, We're not going to miss out on Campo dei Fiori. Campo dei Fiori, the field of flowers, it was called. A bustling market / execution square, where the 16th century heretic monk and philosopher Giordano Bruno, among others, was burned at the stake. By the late Renaissance, when the popes are running the show in Rome, and again, this is from Middle Ages until the 19th century, the popes are in charge. The imperial, the emperors are now a thing of the past, right? Wealthy aristocratic families associated with the papacy outdid one another in this area with building projects, erecting magnificent palazzi in key locations on piazze and streets frequented by locals as well as by pilgrims traveling to the sacred Christian sites of the city in search of salvation. Because let's remember that Rome was the capital city of the Catholic Church. And therefore, going there would ensure, and still does ensure, believers spiritual, if not salvation, a kind of spiritual cleansing, right? Here we have Palazzo Farnese, now the French embassy, which was once the mansion of the powerful Farnese family, and which features a breathtaking fresco entitled The Loves of the Gods. And in November, we'll have the great joy and pleasure of being able to go in there. They're now allowing people to go visit. We'll go see The Loves of the Gods, this incredible ceiling fresco by Annibale Carracci, the 17th century Bolognese artist, very obviously inspired by Michelangelo's earlier Sistine Chapel work, with mythological stories abounding and joyful pagan gods and goddesses and putti prancing around in wild abandon. They're all having a great old time. Huh? This is obviously not religious subject matter. Instead, it speaks to the erudition of the Farnese family and how they were so knowledgeable about the ancient stories of, say, Ovid and Virgil and so on and so forth, and how they knew all of the stories that these pictures referred to. But following in the footsteps of the pilgrims who would be making their way through the city to the various major basilicas of the city, right? We're going to go take in the view of St. Peter's Basilica, the great church dedicated to St. Peter, considered the first father of Catholicism, the first original pope. If we take the Via Giulia right here, another straight street, and again, if we've got a straight street in Rome, it's either Mussolini or the popes. There's no other way, right? So we're going to take the Via Giulia, which is, of course, named after me. Yeah, no, that's not true. But anyway, it's named after Pope Julius II, who commissioned it. We can admire the graceful arch built to support a bridge never completed, connecting the Palazzo Farnese, which is just to our right here, to the Farnesina, the Villa Farnesina across the river, which again we'll go visit in November, with its gorgeous frescoes by Raphael. Because, when you're the Farnese family, why stop at one fresco encrusted palazzo when you can have two? And further along the road, we see the church of Santa Maria dell'Orazione e Morte, St. Mary of Eulogies and Death, established in 1576 to provide rituals and burial for abandoned corpses. Remember that the plague is a continuing problem from the 1300s all the way, late 1200s, 13th century, all the way into the 17th century. And beyond, actually. And I see that there's a question in the chat. I just want to, it's nice to have a street named after me. Exactly. Thank you very much, Lynn. I'm glad you appreciate the largesse of, Julius II, who decides to name that street with his name. All right, so here we have this plaque outside the church entrance, which encourages people to, quote, give to charity for the cemetery's perpetual lamp. That's what you're seeing right here. And it also features a winged skeleton holding a banner proclaiming Hodie mihi cras tibi, which is Latin for me today, you tomorrow. Because remember that the foremost concern of all of these pilgrims going through the city of Rome for centuries was salvation, eternal salvation, right? So you have throughout the centuries, until really the industrial period, until the 19th century, this emphasis on one's spiritual health. And where is one going come the day of judgment? Eventually, we reach the Tiber River, sadly severed from the rest of the city, whose lifeblood it was for millennia, because in the 19th century, they built these really high embankments. You see them, right? It used to be that Rome was flush with the Tiber River. And nowadays, you have to go up to get to the Tiber River. Before you get to those embankments, you can look over the edge of the embankments and down into the river. And there you can see St. Peter's. And of course, we'll save the Basilica and Vatican museums for another time, as we could devote an entire passeggiata to that adventure alone. Or come with me in November and we'll go then. Turning back, we walk down the gorgeous Via dei Coronari, one of my favorite streets in Rome, lined with elegant boutiques and antiquarians, and we stop to get a well-deserved ice cream, a gelato, at the Gelateria del Teatro. Cone in hand, we mosey over to a set of ruins set deep down below the current street level. The huge discrepancy, now we know, in the current street level versus the one when the structure was originally built is the result, of course, of layers of sediment deposited by the flooding Tiber River over the centuries. And what we're looking at are the ruins of the ancient imperial circus of Domitian. There's another circus, yeah? The Circus of Domitian, one of the many oblong oval-shaped tracks used for sports competitions, and which explains the peculiar shape of Rome's most elegant piazza, the Piazza Navona. And here it is. You see the flat end of the circus on one side. There's the famed Four Rivers fountain on the other. And on the curved side, Samsung Galaxy advertisement, right? Because, you know, the present doesn't stop for the past. Okay? Not even in Rome. So, especially not. So we're going to head over to the beautiful fountain in the center of the square. Whoopsie, sorry. There we go. We're looking at Gian Lorenzo Bernini's Four Rivers fountain, featuring the four main rivers of the continents to which the Christian kingdom had spread by this time. The Nile's head is covered because they didn't know where the head of the Nile was at the time. The Danube, the Ganges, and then here, I'm just going to put this, there we go. Here we can see the Amazon, the allegory representing the Amazon River. He's got his arm raised, and the story goes that his arm is raised in perpetual horror at the facade of the church opposite him that was designed by Bernini's rival, Francesco Borromini. Truth is, that's not the case, because the church was actually already there when Bernini built his fountain. But whatever, by now we know, se non è vero, è ben trovato. If it's not true, it makes for a really good story. Yeah? All right, so at this point, I'd like to introduce you to a friend of all Romans. This is none other than Pasquino. He's a little bit worse for the wear. Time has not been very good to him. But Pasquino is one of the talking statues of ancient Rome. For centuries, Pasquino has lampooned the ruling classes with clever poems in Roman dialect that appear mysteriously, usually during the night, at his feet, and thus he talks. It's a safe way to get around prosecution in the days when the popes ruled the city through heavy-handed censorship, but it still provides Romans with a lot of, chuckles. Here I am pointing out some Roman dialect poems during the Berlusconi years not too long ago to some Wonderfeasters from a few years back. In reaction to the Pope's costly vanity project in the center of Piazza Navona, paid for by taxing the people to the point of literal starvation, Pasquino is known to have shouted, "Bread is what we need, not fountains." So saying goodbye to our friend, we wander to nearby San Luigi dei Francesi, one of the two churches of the French community in Rome, to admire the work of the 17th century Baroque artist Caravaggio, specifically Caravaggio's St. Matthew cycle. And the St. Matthew cycle is located in a chapel in the Church of San Luigi dei Francesi, and it was painted for a French cardinal by the name of Mathieu Cointrel. So the patron's name is Matthew, and therefore Matthew is his patron saint. And this plum job established Caravaggio's reputation as an iconoclast, with his trademark tenebrism. Now, what do we mean by tenebrism? Tenebrism is this very, very, very high contrast between light and dark that we associate primarily with Caravaggio, starting with his work in the 17th century and his followers, the artists who then were inspired by him. This is also can be also referred to as extreme chiaroscuro, chiaroscuro being the contrast between light and dark that artists really since the Renaissance have used in order to create the illusion of three-dimensionality. But in addition to that great tenebrism or extreme chiaroscuro, another quality of Caravaggio's is shocking naturalism, right? Remember the Carracci ceiling with all those gods and goddesses prancing around and having a grand old time and drinking and celebrating and so on and so forth? Well, this is a work by Annibale Carracci of a religious nature. Ooh, do I hear somebody has maybe a question or a comment? Somebody has something to add? I thought I heard a microphone unmuting there. No? So this is one of Annibale Carracci's religious pieces. And you'll see that it has nevertheless, and this is exactly contemporary, Carracci and Caravaggio were contemporary. You see that it nevertheless still has a sort of lightness about it. And that primarily comes from the vivid colors, but also from the less extreme chiaroscuro than what we see in the tenebrous Caravaggio works. On top of that, you'll notice that the figures are dressed in kind of like pseudo-Roman looking garb. Yeah, I mean, this is ancient. These are the apostles and the Virgin Mary. And so they're dressed in the style that Annibale Carracci thought people wore back in the 1st century CE, right? So you have long tunics and flowing robes and whatnot. If you look over here at the Calling of St. Matthew by Caravaggio, which is on this wall, you'll notice that you have figures dressed in very, very 17th century garb. So Caravaggio's doing something really weird in the eyes of most people at this time. Okay. In fact, that dogged naturalism is what got Caravaggio in trouble a few times. His original St. Matthew altarpiece was rejected because the evangelist, this is the original, the evangelist was represented as an oafish, illiterate, sort of almost dock worker. Yeah. Notice how big and muscular he is and how sort of, awkward the folding of his legs. And look at how the angel is pushing his hand across the page. And the look of intense concentration on his furrowed brow. This picture was rejected by Monsieur Cointrel, the cardinal. So Caravaggio had to paint a second version, which is this one here, which is what we have today in the chapel. And now, leaving the church, we head over to one of the holiest of Roman sites, the Bar Sant'Eustachio, considered to have the best coffee in all of Rome. This is probably a pandemic picture. I mean, the face mask on the waiter kind of gives it away, and the fact that it's pretty empty inside. Okay, because this is what it usually looks like. It's pretty crammed when you go in there. And the reason it's crammed is because it's considered the best coffee in downtown Rome. The recipe is so secret that they have blinders on the sides of the coffee maker so nobody can see what happens back there. Each time, though, you get a thimbleful of rich, dark, syrupy espresso with a mind-blowing layer of creamy foam on top that somehow mysteriously does not contain dairy, right? It's divine. And my father used to say that it's the only coffee that you ever had to drink with a spoon. And reinvigorated, we walk around the corner to the Pantheon, one of the most awe-inspiring buildings of the Imperial Roman era. This 2nd century CE pagan temple was transformed into a church in the early Middle Ages, thus escaping the destruction that most imperial structures actually underwent. It's the one building in Rome that you want to run to if it's raining, not to seek refuge, but rather to see the water bucketing down the opening at the top of the dome known as the oculus and into the almost unnoticeable drain holes in the pavement below. Better yet, because it just happens to be the Feast of Pentecost, because during our Passeggiata, we have timed it in such a way that it happens to be the Feast of Pentecost, which commemorates the day that the Holy Spirit descended upon the gathered apostles after Christ's ascension. We will attend Mass in the Pantheon/church so that we can watch the grand finale on this feast day. The breathtaking spectacle of a cascade of rose petals raining down from the oculus to create a breathtaking carpet of red roses at our feet, as we see here. And we will cry because you just can't help it. It is so moving. And believe it or not, this is the job of the Vigili del Fuoco, of Rome's fire brigade. The Roman firefighters are charged with going up to the very, very tippy top of the Pantheon and throwing bagfuls of red rose petals down into the oculus, into the Pantheon, to create this carpet of red roses that we see the clergy members walking across at the end of the Mass. From here, we walk over to the Via del Corso, named after the corse, or the races. We've just come out of the Pantheon. We're off to the Via del Corso, named after the corse, or races that were held here during the carnival in Renaissance period. And we go up the Via Condotti. And here is the Via Condotti with its very elegant and chic designer stores on both sides, flanking the road to the famous Spanish Steps, which should actually be called the French Steps, because they were paid for by a French diplomat who wanted a more elegant approach to the city's other French church at the top of the hill. There was once just a sort of, dusty hill here. But the piazza at the foot of the steps has been known forever as the Piazza di Spagna, because Spain's embassy to the papal Holy See has been here since the 15th century. It's the world's oldest ongoing, still extant embassy. So, sorry, French diplomat, but c'est la vie, or should we say, así es la vida, no? And we climb up the Spanish Steps to our very well-earned aperitivo. It's time to do as the Romans do and sit, taking in the magnificent city before us, prosecco or spritz in hand, and savor the colors and flavors and sights that we have enjoyed on our magnificent Roman passeggiata. And as we say in Rome, cin cin e alla salute. Cheers and to your health. And grazie. Thank you. Thank you, Douglas.